What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to College Football Talk with Peter Burtnett, and in today's episode, we are talking about the Ohio State Buckeyes, or should I say Backeyes, because Ohio State is bringing back a massive amount of production from this past season, and they are certainly showing that they have their eyes fixed on, first of all, beating Michigan for the first time since 2019, and also maybe making a run at the first championship in the 12-team era. Before I dive into this video, if you go on to enjoy, please feel free to leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on those post notifications so you're always up to date whenever I post. But without further ado, let's dive into it. And first things first, we have to start with this backfield because it's probably the best in college football, certainly in the Big Ten, and certainly one of the best nationally. You have Travion Henderson, who easily could have declared for the NFL draft, has had well over 400 carries for the Buckeyes over the last 3 seasons, and this past season, he rushed 156 times for 926 yards and 11 touchdowns. And then coming in is the Ole Miss transfer, probably the best running back or maybe second best running back in the SEC this past year, and that's Quinshon Judkins from Ole Miss. The running back rushed 271 times, so he got a lot of carries, definitely a lot more than Henderson, for 1,158 yards and 15 touchdowns, and he's second most in FBS over the last 2 seasons in yards and touchdowns with 2,725 yards and 31 touchdowns for the Rebels. I think what this showcases is, first of all, a dynamism to the Ohio State offense. I think the last few years they've gotten a little bit more into the passing game, which has worked, especially being able to get to the semifinal game in the college football playoff last year against Georgia. And we're just, literally a field goal away from winning and getting the national championship game. So it has paid dividends. They continue to produce year after year the best wide receivers in college football. That was shown this year with the Biletnikoff winner, Marvin Harrison Jr., who's one of the few on this team to be taking his talents to the NFL, where he'll be, honestly, probably a top 5 selection. I think there's, very little debate about that. I think certainly top 10, but I really don't see any reason for him to fall to the top 5 unless those teams don't have a need of a wide receiver. But I think for a generational type receiver like Harrison Jr., you kind of have to use that pick if you have it and if he's available on the board, even in that top 5. However, where this Ohio State offense and this team overall has been at its best historically is when they run the ball well. You obviously have the only 2-time Heisman Trophy winner running back Archie Griffin in the mid-'70s, and then you also have Eddie George, and their most recent national championship, 2014, Ezekiel Elliott, in one of the best seasons in Ohio State football. Did not win the Heisman, but had a phenomenal season nonetheless. So I think when this team is at their best and when they win national championships is when they could run the ball. Freshman Maurice Clarett burst onto the scene in 2002 to lead the Buckeyes to the championship. And obviously, of course, it's built around the defense. But I think an Ohio State team that can run the ball well is at its best to have the highest level of success. And, of course, they're going to throw the ball well, too, because they have, they're the best offensive guard who probably would have been a first or second round NFL draft pick, Donovan Jackson, certainly a draft pick. I don't know exactly where he's at where he was at on the projections in the mock drafts. And then you also have wide receiver Emeka Egbuka coming back. He was kind of the number 2 guy behind Harrison this year. Obviously, you do lose Julian Fleming to Penn State. I think the team he was either originally committed to or the team that was pursuing him the strongest when he was a high school recruit. So that will be a loss to be able to handle for this Buckeyes offense. But you have Will Howard coming in, and I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag with him. He, over the last 2 years especially, has proven that he's been able to win. He led the Kansas State Wildcats to the Big 12 championship last year, 2022, and he's 13-5 over the last 2 seasons as a starter. He had a few starts here and there in his first 2 years out in Manhattan, Kansas. But overall, Will Howard has showcased his ability to win. Is he the most impressive, incredible quarterback out there? No, I wouldn't say so. But if he can manage, if he can make some big throws here and there, and if he can lean on the talented wide receivers that he has, I think Will Howard can do a very, very good job for the Buckeyes. And he has some young guys at wide receiver. Carnell Tate, who was every Ohio State wide receiver, it seems like now, was either an upper-level 4-star or more often than not a 5-star as well. That was very hyped up as a prospect. Tate had some good catches here and there this past season. You've got sophomore Brandon Innes as well, and then 5-star Jeremiah Smith, who will be a true freshman this year, one of the, if not the top player overall, certainly the top receiver in this year's recruiting class. So there will be plenty of options for Howard to throw to, plenty of weapons for him to make use of, and each of those guys adds their own skill set to the offense at wide receiver. And so offensively, I think the Buckeyes will look maybe a little bit different. I mean, another thing obviously that's huge is Ryan Day giving over play calling duties, I would assume most likely to Brian Hartline. He's done such a fantastic job in recruiting, in developing wide receivers, and obviously got the bump up to offensive coordinator. So I would imagine that's where play calling duties go, but it'd be interesting to see what the play calling looks like with Hartline, or maybe if it is somebody else taking over. And that's something I do want to address before I get into the defensive side of the ball, just kind of the play calling of Ryan Day and just kind of his tenure as a whole. So obviously, I mean, his overall record is very impressive, but what it boils down to is, can you win those big games? And it just seems like in the biggest games under Ryan Day, the Buckeyes have crumbled, or at the very least, they've lost the biggest games. You know, it's not always it's not a collapse. You know, it hasn't always been like 2021 or especially 2022 against Michigan. But there have been moments where just late they can't quite make quite enough plays to get the job done or make the stop on defense, whatever the case might be. And in those big games, first and foremost, the games that come first, he's 1-3 against Michigan. He's 1-1 in bowls outside of the college football playoff, and he's 1-3 in the college football playoff. So that, you know, those big postseason type games, Michigan obviously isn't a postseason game, but it is basically the start of the postseason for Ohio State and for Michigan. He's gone just 3-7 in those really, really big games. And so I think that is something to keep an eye on. You know, is it head coaching? Is it just that the teams that they've been matched up with in those games are simply better than them, more prepared, whatever the case is? I think that is something to kind of think about for this Ohio State team as long as Ryan Day is at the helm. I still believe that he can lead this Buckeye team to the highest level of success. I mean, in his second full year in charge, he led the Buckeyes to the national championship game where they were up against a just overpowered Alabama offense. But I do think this year it's kind of ripe for the taking. You know, they get the Wolverines at home. They do have to travel to Penn State and Oregon. But I think if you can go 2-1 in those 3 games, you're even 1-2 in those games, you're a shoo-in for the college football playoff with the field expanding to 12 this year. But I think what Buckeye fans will want to see is they'll want to see the Buckeyes go 3-0 in those games. I think it's, you know, there's no need to panic if they go 2-1, but I think definitely Buckeye Nation wants to see a win over that team up north this year. So then switching over to the defense, and this is where, you know, there are probably where there is the most certainty and the most, you know, returning production coming back and the biggest names and everything. I think one question, though, I'd seen maybe there was some interest in hiring him for a head coaching job. If Jim Knowles, the defensive coordinator, stays, I think that obviously would be huge, but I think the foundation that he set this year with the players, 8 returning starters coming back, will be in good hands if he does end up leaving for another opportunity. But those 8 returning starters, you've got JT Tuimoloau, probably the biggest returning player. Cornerback Denzel Burke is also huge for leading that secondary. Defensive end Jack Sawyer, defensive tackle Tyleek Williams, safety Lathan Ransom, safety Jordan Hancock, defensive lineman Ty Hamilton, and then linebacker Cody Simon. Those are all guys who are coming back and all started basically every game, I imagine, and were huge pieces of this Buckeyes defense. You obviously lose a linebacker and a leader like Tommy Eichenberg, but I think in that linebacker position, Cody Simon can kind of step into that role, kind of leading things in the middle of the defense. But I think the Ohio State defense, I mean, they were top 5 or top 10 in every key, you know, defensive metric this past season, or most of them. You know, they were up there with Michigan and Penn State for having the best defenses, not only in the Big Ten, but in the nation. So if they can maintain that production, they'll have a new opposition in a team like Oregon next year that maybe will challenge that in a different way than especially a Penn State did this year, because the Nittany Lions offense was honestly atrocious at times, certainly at least in the big games. They still have an impressive year. They finish 10-3 with a loss to Ole Miss in the Peach Bowl, but overall I think this defense is going to be potentially, I think Michigan still has a case. I think people kind of maybe forget or overlook just how much of their defense is returning this next season. But I do think the Buckeyes have a chance to be the top defense in the Big Ten, and because of how those metrics have been the last couple of years, that would make them one of the best defenses in the country. So that is certainly something to keep an eye on. I was watching, this video, I guess, not the idea so much, but the execution of it comes from watching the Joel Klatt show, where he released his way too early top 10, and he talked about the lone question mark for the Buckeyes kind of being that offensive line. I think having a guy like Jackson coming back to kind of lead the way at guard is big. I think, I'd have to take a deeper dive, and I'll maybe pop up the names of the guys who will be the likely starters in 2024. But I think, sometimes a good O-line is obviously the most important thing. Michigan has proved that, and even Washington, winning the Joe Moore Award to get to the national championship game, have proven that the best O-line is often what it takes to win the big games. So if that's a question mark, that could be huge. That could be the difference for this Ohio State team from reaching the pinnacle of college football and even beating Michigan again. I think that is the one thing that keeps me from saying I think this is a certainty that this team can get back to the top. I'm fairly confident, as somebody who grew up in Buckeye country and would consider myself a Buckeye fan. I'm confident in what this team can look like next year and what they could potentially accomplish. I think it does help to have Michigan at home next year. But the Wolverines are certainly, whether they have Jim Harbaugh or Sharon Moore or somebody else at head coach, I think they'll be very, very good again next year, and they'll be very tough to beat. But there's a lot to look forward to with this Ohio State team next year. Like I said at the beginning of this video, they're kind of the top team when it comes to returning production. I think Georgia is going to be up there as well. Klatt had them at number 1. He had Ohio State at 2 and Oregon at 3, which is a very interesting top 3. I think that's a very accurate assessment, especially with Dan Lanning staying out in Eugene. But it's something to look forward to. I mean, for Buckeye fans out there, for Buckeye Nation, the Scarlet and Gray have a good opportunity to get back to the mountaintop, and they were the first team to win the 4-team college football playoff, and who knows, maybe they'll be the first to win the 12-team. I think Georgia certainly is still the favorite, but Ohio State is kind of right there behind the Bulldogs. So comment your thoughts below, what you think about this Ohio State team. What do you expect their record to be next year? How far in this new college football playoff do you expect them to get? And comment your thoughts on what you're looking forward to the rest of this 2024 offseason. But that's it for this video of College Football Talk. I'm your host, Peter Burtnett, signing out. Peace.